You've been scrolling through endless lists of matte cutters, trying to find something that won't just sit on a shelf gathering dust, but actually helps you finish a project without a second guess. You want a tool that's reliable, easy enough to fit into a daily routine, and worth the money you're about to spend, not a shiny gadget that looks impressive on paper but falls apart the first time you need a clean cut. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The biggest worry most of us have is ending up with a cutter that either jams on thicker board, forces you into awkward adjustments, or simply takes more time than it saves, and that feeling of wasted cash can make any purchase feel risky. When I started digging into the matte cutting world, I realized the market is split between cheap hobby models that barely handle a single ply board and industrial-grade machines that cost as much as a small car. The Logan 855 Platinum Edge sits somewhere in the middle, promising super smooth cutting and a few features that sound good on a spec sheet, but the real test is how it behaves when you're actually cutting a 4-ply museum board for a client's portrait or trimming an 8-ply mat for a gallery-ready canvas. I've spent the past few weeks watching a handful of framing studios, talking to a couple of art teachers, and even trying the cutter myself in my own small workspace, so let's break down what that experience looked like. First off, the cutter's size. At 48 inches, the cutting arm spans enough length to handle most standard matte pieces you'll encounter in a framing shop, but it also means you need a decent amount of table space. If you're working out of a cramped hobby table in a bedroom, you'll probably spend a few minutes rearranging your tools just to get the cutter in place. That's not a deal breaker for a serious hobbyist who can dedicate a corner of a garage or a studio, but it's definitely something to consider if you're limited to a kitchen counter. The thing that really sets the 855 apart is the microadjustable moving magnetic stop and the accompanying matte guide. In practice, this means you can slide the stop along the cutting rail in tiny increments, which is a lifesaver when you're trying to achieve that perfect 2-inch border on a piece that's already been measured down to the millimeter. I found that once you get the feel for the magnetic click, you can set a repeatable stop and then just feed each successive board through without having to remeasure each time. For a professional framer who does dozens of identical mats in a day, that consistency translates directly into faster turnaround and fewer errors. Cutting smoothness is another claim Logan makes, and in real use it holds up. The blade Logan's Model 267 replacement is a high-carbon steel that stays sharp through multiple cuts of 4-ply board, and even when I pushed it through a thick 8-ply museum mat, the blade didn't snag or produce ragged edges. The cut surface was clean enough that I didn't need to sand or trim the edges afterward, which is a small but significant time saver. If you're accustomed to using a utility knife and then having to clean up the rough edges, the difference is pretty noticeable. One practical downside I noticed is the blade change process. While the cutter is marketed as having a quick blade swap, you still have to open the housing, remove the old blade, and snap the new one in place. It's not a complicated operation, but it does require a steady hand, and if you're swapping blades frequently, say you're moving between cutting lightweight cardstock and heavy museum board, you'll find yourself stopping a couple of times a day just to make the exchange. The kit doesn't come with extra blades, so you'll need to budget for spare Model 267 blades, which adds a small recurring cost. Another point worth mentioning is the learning curve around the magnetic stop. Because it moves in such fine increments, it can be easy to over-adjust and end up a fraction of a millimeter off your intended cut. The first few pieces you make will feel a bit like a balancing act, especially if you're used to the more satin forget stops on cheaper models. However, once you get a feel for the tension and the click, the precision it offers is hard to beat. In a professional setting, that precision can mean the difference between a perfectly centered artwork and a visibly off-center mat that the client notices immediately. Now, who should actually consider buying the Logan 855 Platinum Edge? If you run a small to medium framing business, the cutter's ability to handle both 4-ply and 8-ply boards without changing accessories means you can keep a single machine on the shop floor and serve a broader range of client needs. Art teachers who run after-school framing projects will also appreciate the consistent stop. Students can set a measurement once and then each group can repeat it without constant supervision. Even serious hobbyists who produce